right, let's get started. Welcome back. Hopefully it hasn't been too long since we've last seen each other that you have completely forgotten everything that you've remembered about Access. Something before we get started, I do want to let you know I am postponing the next in-class exercise. It was going to be this coming Thursday. I'm going to move it to Tuesday, a week from today. And the reason why I'm doing that is I would like to have today's class and the next class to kind of get on a roll with some of the more difficult concepts in Access, and then give you the opportunity to work on the in-class exercise. The idea behind the in-class exercises is they give you a chance to show yourself what you've learned. Make sure that you're on target with what you should be learning. So we need to get some things under our belt before then. I'm going to start out today by going through some things that you should have gotten from the book, some things that you've had a little bit of practice already doing in Access, and just go through a little bit of the fundamentals about it. So that way, as you go through the mechanics with your lab and with the textbook, you understand why you're doing some of the things that you're doing. So going back into Access, and we're going to look again at that research papers database. Again, it's a database for people who want to have their papers typed up, not their papers written for them. So it's the typewriting, the writing out of the papers. And we have Boolean logic in Access, just like we did in Excel. So for those of you who just absolutely loved Boolean logic in Excel, don't worry, it's back. Here it is. But it's not as complicated in Access. So we are going to look at Boolean logical type statements, and we'll see a difference in the way in which they have to be handled based on whether or not the Boolean logical arguments themselves are forming from the same field condition or from multiple field conditions. So whether the Boolean logic itself is because of multiple arguments within the same field or within multiple fields. So the first question that we're faced with, what page are we on in the slides? 137. That's not the first problem we're faced with, but for those of you who are kind of strumming through the book. So with looking at this, we want to determine the first name, last name, and amount for all clients who paid more than $250 or $250 or more, or made payments of less than $75. So here we have multiple conditions, and together they form an or statement. So anyone who has paid this much or this much. And in Access, we have the ability to do this in a couple of different ways. And I talked about this before and said, if you look at the bottom of the QBE grid, you will notice that there are, underneath the criteria line, some additional lines. And the first one underneath criteria says or. So you have these built-in or statements that you can create based on using those separate lines underneath the criteria line. And even though you only see an or under under the first criteria line, all of these lines, which yes, I know they are hard to see on this projection screen, but you've been in Access and you've seen that there are additional lines. Each one of those represents a potential or statement. And so for us to be able to write statements that form an and argument, we have the ability to break up the arguments, or we can put them together underneath the same field. So here, these two arguments are both based on the same field, amount. One of the ways that you could write this would be on the criteria line underneath amount, and this is what you should have been seeing in the book and in lab, that I could say greater than or equal to 250, space, then the or operator, space, less than 75. And when we run that query, we would get this set of results. And these are the same results that you're seeing in your book. I'm just not going to go back and forth between PowerPoint and Access, if I can stay in Access to show you some of these things. But now we can utilize that built-in or underneath the criteria line. So instead of putting all these conditions on one line with ors, separating them, I can say greater than or equal to 250, drop down one criteria line, and put less than 75. And notice that'll give us the same result. So we can kind of double check whether or not these things are working out right, because we can compare them to the results that we saw before. These two ways of expressing an or statement are consistent with each other. And we would expect to get the same results. Let me turn this sound off so that we're not hearing this every time I save a query. And that's what you see in the slides, both ways to represent the same concept. Now, if we wanted to write an and statement, instead of using separate lines, we would use the same criteria line to express an and statement. But in this situation, we're looking at multiple field conditions. So we're looking to get the last name, first name, amount, and the payment date for all clients who paid more than $100 on or after March 3rd of 2008. So the two conditions are based on the amount paid and the date. So two different fields, and they form and statements. We want to see just those people who paid this amount, and they also did so after this specific date. And what you're noticing in the slide is that the conditions must be on the same criteria line in order for Access to read them as an and statement. And if we open up Access, that's also the same thing that you're seeing here. Now, the order of the fields in the QBE grid, it doesn't matter what order I put those fields in right now. There's only going to be one situation where it matters, and I'll clearly point that out to you so that you're aware of it. But it is important that you notice the conditions themselves have to be under the right fields. So if I tried to put greater than 100 and then continue on this condition underneath amount, maybe say and greater than or equal to 3/3 of 2008, if I tried to write all of that underneath the amount field, it makes no sense to Access. So the conditions themselves have to be underneath the fields for which they apply. Now, one of the things that's interesting that you may have noticed, hopefully when you were playing around with Access, is that when you type in a date, so 3/3/2008, so greater than or equal to means on or after. When I click outside of this line, notice that pound signs are placed around the date itself. Now, this is something automatic that Access should do for you if it recognizes the date format that you've used. So if you're putting in a date restriction, so a criteria of a date underneath the date field, if Access recognizes the date format you're using, it will put pound signs in around the date automatically. What this means is when you're in Access, if you put in a date on a criteria line and Access doesn't put pound signs in, you should be very worried about how Access is interpreting your criteria. So far, so good? Oh, and did we get to look at the results of that? So these would be our results. And again, the order of the fields in the QBE grid doesn't matter one darn bit. Now, sorting fields, and sorting is really very simple. Sorting is just a matter of telling Access, I'd like to sort these fields by saying so on the sort line. You can sort up to, actually, I think you can sort every field in your query if you'd like. But as you'll see in a minute, there is kind of a realistic limit to the number of fields that you might want to sort. When you're sorting by just one field, that by itself doesn't change the order in which the fields should show up in your QBE grid. So this particular question says, let's list the city and state of all the clients. And it doesn't say so, but we're going to say by client ID. So we have to have some indicator of the client. We're going to say we're going to list it by client ID. And it says this list, or the results, should be sorted in ascending order by state and then by city. So here I clearly specified that I want to sort by two different fields. The idea behind this is I may have many, many clients who are from the same state, and I do want to have some order to the way in which they show up. So all the people who are from the same state, I would like to see those records then sorted in alphabetical order by city. It's kind of the same idea behind, in the phone book, you would have the phone book itself sorted in alphabetical order by last name, but then all of the people who have the same last name are then sorted in alphabetical order by first name. So it's easier to find people who share the same last name. So same kind of idea here. Let's go in and see what this looks like. So in this particular situation, sorting fields and the mechanics of this you should have already seen in the book. But if you click on the sort line, you should get, well, actually three options: ascending, descending, and not sorted. If you don't want to sort a field, you do not need to pick not sorted. That basically just gives you what you had before you did anything. But here I'm sorting by two fields. And for Access to know which field is being sorted first and which field is being sorted second, I have to tell Access that by the way in which I place the fields in the grid. So the fact that I've placed state before city, and those are both my sorted fields, means that Access is going to apply the major sort precedence to the state field and the minor sort precedence to the city field. Let's see how this looks when we run it. Let's expand this just a little bit. Now you notice the major sort precedence right away. The state field has entries listed in alphabetical order. The secondary sort of city, you don't really notice it unless you have multiple entries from the same state. So within those entries, you would then see the city field sorted in ascending order. Now, if I didn't really take much time to consider the order in which these two fields showed up in my QBE grid, if I put city before state, I would get very different results. Now what I'm seeing is that we're sorting in alphabetical order by city, and then for people who are in the same city, then we see their state sorted in alphabetical order, which doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense because their states would be the same anyways. And if you think about last names and first names, if we had folks who, we had maybe a very long list of people, and we wanted to see the sort by last name and then first name, if you got that mixed up and instead had everybody with the same first name together and then sorted within last name after that, that would make it very difficult to find people. So this is really the only time that you have to worry about the order in which your fields show up in the QBE grid. And the order that matters is just the sorted fields. The unsorted field, like client ID, we weren't told that that field should be sorted. That field can be anywhere. So it's just the order of the sorted fields. So far, so good? All right, so next thing we're going to take a look at has to do with aggregating, or what's known as subtotaling. So in Access, there can be times where we would like to look at some results, but maybe give some more of a summary meaning to the results that we get. One of the things that we look at, and I'm going to kind of start this out maybe just a little bit at a time. So let's say I wanted to run a query to list the client ID, the last name, the first name, and the payment amount for all of the clients who have made payments. And I run this query, and this is a very nice query. It shows me exactly what I asked for, correct? Now imagine that we have thousands of entries in the underlying tables that we've used, and so perhaps the results that we get number in the tens of thousands. It is possible. And it's likely when you get out of here, that's what you're going to be seeing. And as I look at this, I happen to notice that some of the clients show up again and again. Now, why would that be happening? Is there a problem with these results? I mean, we have seen some situations where if I don't establish my relationship when I'm running a query, I may get a lot of results, and some of them may be bogus. Why would I be seeing people repeating? Yeah. I do have the relationships matched up. So we'll double check this. So that isn't the problem, and maybe I'll add another hint to this. This isn't problematic. So there's actually a good reason, a legitimate reason why we see some of these people repeating. Over here.
Is it like showing payments that
Yeah. So what does that mean about why we see people repeating? They've made multiple payments, yeah, and probably the people who've made multiple payments are the same people who've brought in multiple papers for us to type up. Or maybe they brought in just one paper and they've just been making small payments all along the way, but they've made multiple payments. So this is okay. Now we have seen situations where it's not okay, but this one's okay. And it's not nonsensical. When we have seen relationships that haven't been established, in fact, let's take that relationship out just so we can, for old time's sake, see the kind of weird things Access does. That would be an example of Access not knowing about that relationship. So we would see some repeating entries that are just nuts. Absolutely crazy. So as I look at this, I might be thinking, you know, it'd be awfully nice if those people who have paid multiple times, if I could just see them showing up one time and maybe see the total amount of their payments instead of me having to go through to figure out how many payments did they make? 1, 2, 3 for Nancy. Actually, I took one of hers out, so she's only got 2 now. And who else do I have? Mark Johnson's got 3. And then I want to total up the value of their payments. I have to get a calculator out if the numbers got too big. That's not something I want to have to do myself because it takes a long time and I'm likely to mess something up along the way. And we don't have to rely on ourselves to do that, thank God. There's a way in Access to summarize results, and that's what we're looking at right now. When we have entries that repeat for a reason, a good reason, but we'd really like to see their overall effect on the data in our database, we can use what's called the totals line. And this is not something that you would easily just kind of stumble upon in Access. It's hidden, and it's something I'm going to show you how to access. But when we specify that we're going to use the totals line, we're telling Access that there is potentially going to be a field that we want to group by or restrict, and some other fields that we want to aggregate or count or sum or average. So there's going to be some sort of an aggregation involved here. And when we do this, Access determines, based on what's called the lowest detail level field, and I'll explain more about that in a little bit, but it looks for the lowest detail level field being grouped, and it goes in and it aggregates based on that lowest detail level field. So that was not what I wanted to do. There we go. So if we go into Access and we pull up the totals line, so if you look at the design ribbon under Show Hide Grouping, there's something that says totals. And when I click that, I automatically get a new line showing up in my QBE grid. Now normally what would happen would be every single option would by default have group by underneath it. The reason why you saw sum under amount was because earlier today I used the totals line in the morning class and I summed it, and then I just went in and hid the line later, and that sum was still remembered because I've already used it today. So by default, though, when you haven't used the totals line in a query, it will say group by for everything. You don't want to leave all of the options as group by. In fact, the whole reason why you're using the totals line is because you're aggregating something. So if your totals line says group by all the way across, you've done something wrong. And at the other side of this extreme is that if you pull up the totals line, once you do that, all of your fields in your QBE grid have to have some entry on the totals line underneath it. Nothing should be blank if you're using the totals line. So let's take a look at what we're doing. The idea was for me to summarize by the client the total value of their payments. If we look at some of the options that we would get, you can also see this in your slides. The first one is the group by. That's the entry underneath the field that we're going to summarize. Now, it is possible also to not group by any field. We can go in and subtotal a field for every entry within a table without really grouping by any particular feature. And that's something I'll show you a little later on. But the rest of the features, up until the last two, are all aggregate functions. So we can sum, average, min, meaning get the lowest value, max, getting the highest, count up the number of entries that correspond to what you're grouping by, standard deviation, variance, first, last. And then the last two, called expression and where, are used for very specific purposes. Expression is going to be the entry that we would place underneath a calculated field or an expression if we're also using the totals line. And where is going to be what we use when we're using the totals line, and we also have a field that we need to include because there's a restriction based on it. And we'll get some experience with that here in just a little bit. So for us to get the total value of payments corresponding to the particular clients, we would use a sum and sum up the amount. Now, if I wanted to know how many payments have been made by each client, what would I do for that? Let's just run this real quick, just so you can get a sense of what this looks like so far. But I also want to have a column that tells me how many payments have been made. So for Mark, it should say 3. For Nancy, it should say 2. What do you think I'm going to do? What aggregate function would I possibly use for that? What do you think? I'd use a counted function. And when it comes to the field that you use, here's something kind of nice. It doesn't matter what field you count. I can count any field I want from the payments table, and it's going to give me the same exact answer regardless of what field it is. So we're going to count each and every one of these, just so you can see I'm not making this up. And we should expect to see the same entry for every single field that we've counted. And that is, of course, what we're seeing. Now, why does that happen? Why do we get the same number regardless of what field we count? The reason is because with a counted field, we're simply asking Access, how many entries did you find, for example, in the amount field, that correspond to the same client ID? How many entries of payment date did you find that correspond to the same client ID, or whatever it is you happen to be grouping by? That's what a counted field is, and that's what it does. So I'm going to take out some of these now just so that we can go back and talk a little bit more about these. So what I should be noticing is that none of these clients is repeating. Each one shows up once and only once. And as you think about this in bigger terms, because when you look at these query results, this Dynaset, doesn't it kind of look like a table? Does it look like a table? It's got a field name, it's got a bunch of records, right? Eventually we're going to use these queries as tables. They're going to become tables that we can use in other queries. We can use queries in other queries. But what we've done by using the totals line is we've created our own unique field here. Client ID is unique because we've summarized, because we've said access don't show any clients more than once. But to take this a step further, what I do want you to notice, if we are going to use this query as a query in another query, the field names are different when you aggregate. So the field amount that we summed, it's now called sum of amount. So the new field names, when you aggregate, should be the field name that originally existed with the aggregate function tacked to the beginning. So sum of amount, count of client ID. So if we use this query later on in another query, these field names will look different because they've been aggregated. All right, so let's go back for a second. Anybody confused by the fact that I have group by underneath 3 different fields? It says group by, group by, group by. And I said, when you aggregate in a query, Access looks at all the fields that have a group by underneath it, and it picks the lowest detail level field, and that's what it groups by. The truth is, sometimes you are going to have more than one field with a group by underneath it in your query. In this particular case, the client ID, the first name, and the last name, they're all connected with each other. So there really isn't any lowest detail level field per se. But sometimes that's not always the case. So if I were to pull in, let's say I got a little carried away with this query. I'm excited. I'm learning how to subtotal. I'd also like to see the payment type. Now, as soon as I pop in a brand new field into this QBE grid, notice Access automatically puts a group by underneath it by default. Remember, once you use the totals line, that totals line cannot be blank for any of the fields. So by default, Access says, let's just give you a group by. Sometimes we want to keep it there. Sometimes we don't. We really need to pay attention to that. All right. We kept a group by underneath these first 3 fields, and nothing bad happened. In fact, let's just move this field over so that all the group bys are together, because that could throw people off. Maybe since the group by is somewhere else, that's what throws Access off. And I go back and I run this query and think, oh, wait a second. Wait. Well, that's more entries than we had before, isn't it? And now I do see some of these clients repeating. Oh, crap. Well, I'm not grouping by client ID anymore. I'm not grouping by client. Some of these clients are now repeating. Things were going so well for us. We had it all figured out. And then we went in and we threw in that darn payment type field. So what happened was, just like I told you, Access looks at all of the fields that have group by underneath it, and it goes, all right, which one's the lowest detail level field? Well, client ID, first name, last name, those are all connected, so they're not really, none is lower in detail than the other. But that payment type field, well, and lowest detail level field means the field that has the least number of associations with other fields in the database. And Access looks at this and it goes, well, the very lowest detail level of any of these payments is the payment type. And how many of you are thinking, how the hell did she even know that? Anybody thinking that? Or was it just kind of obvious? Go, yeah, that's definitely lowest detail. Because it's not all that obvious sometimes before you run a query which field's going to be the lowest detail level field. Sometimes, a lot of times, you don't know it until you run the query and you go, oh, look at that. I'm not grouping by what I wanted to group by anymore. So this whole idea of lowest detail level is not something that just is easy. It's not something that you can always figure out without looking at the results. So I do want to let you know that that's something that doesn't come with time. It just, especially with the databases that we'll get to where we have, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 tables in the database and all these different connections going on. It's not always easy to predict. So what happened was, if I tell Access that I would like to summarize all of the payments by client, but then I want to see something about each payment in particular. Every payment that a client makes could have a different payment type. So Access says, I cannot summarize all these payments by client ID and still show you detail level that corresponds to each individual payment. That's what Access is saying to me. All right, so I go back and I say, yeah, that was kind of dumb. I should have known that. And I just yank that field out. I just take that payment type field out. Oh, wait, I can't. What would be a reason why I can't? What would be a reason why I can't take that payment type field out? Somebody says, you know, these results should be based on only those payments that were made with a payment type of 1 or 2. Oh, wait a second. I've got a criteria I have to place. Crud. Well, I put in the criteria, so I can't just take out the payment type field, and I certainly can't stick the criteria somewhere else. And I run the query. Yep, not grouping by, I mean, I do see fewer entries, but I'm still not grouping by the client. This would be that situation that I was telling you about where instead of leaving this as a group by, remember those two options at the bottom, expression and where? I said where is used for situations where you're using the totals line and you also have a field with a criteria in it. We're going to change this to a where. But before we do that, how many of you are thinking, why doesn't she just uncheck that stinking checkbox? Nobody's thinking that. That will be the first time in all of history of me teaching this that nobody has wondered that. Well, guess what? I'm going to show you anyways. So if I uncheck that checkbox and I rerun this query, it doesn't do anything. So just so that you know that. So I go back in. I change my group by to a where. Now this is the reason why I uncheck that box. Because when I use the where, Access does uncheck the show checkbox, but that's not all it's doing. The other thing Access is doing is it's saying to itself, okay, don't use this field when you're trying to figure out which field is lowest in detail level. Just look at it for the criteria and don't look at it for anything else. That's what Access is saying to itself when we make this a where. And now I rerun the query, and I do see summarization. I do see none of these clients repeating. Questions on that? All right. So as I do this, this is a really great opportunity for me to show you something else. So up until now, we've been running some queries. Okay, we'll leave this just the way it is. We've been running some queries where we use two tables together. You've seen some queries in lab where you do that. You've also seen some queries in lab where you use 3 and 4 tables together. The mechanics of that process is simple. When you get into the window where you pick the tables you want to show, you just make sure those tables are up in the design view window, right? So the mechanics of doing that is pretty darn simple. But the behind the scenes of what's going on in Access is a bit different. So we do want to look at that today. What's really going on when you've got 2 tables up there, 3 tables up there? Now, today we're probably not going to tackle any of the whole 3-table process. And I can tell you and I can assure you that in lab up until now, when you've had to use 3 or 4 tables in your design view window, it's been okay to do that. So eventually I am going to show you what happens, some of the warning signals, some of the potential problems that you can run into when you have to use 3 and 4 tables in a query, but you can be rest assured that none of those situations have happened to you yet in lab. Okay? So what I want to do is show you the results of this query. Okay, we saw that before, Michelle, big deal. Now I would ask you, is this all of the clients that we have in our client database? Oh, I don't know. Let's take a look. This is the client table. I should have 16 clients. Now I did go in, I grouped, and I summed by client, so nobody's repeating. So this really represents 7 individual clients and their payments. Where the heck are the other ones? Where are the other 9 clients? And how many of you assumed when we got these results that we were seeing all of the clients? So what's going on here? Why am I only seeing 7 of these clients? Because Access felt lazy today and only wanted to show us 7? Back here. Ooh, only 7 of them made payments. Why would that matter? You're right. Why would that matter? You're working backwards from your result. You're right, though. You're absolutely right about, yeah, it's because these are the only people who have made payments. Anybody want to take that a step further? She's right. Back here. So maybe you're thinking that if I didn't total up this query, we might see all of them? Let's take a peek and see if that changes it. Now I see 10, but it's actually not representing 3 extra clients. It's representing those extra records by Mark and Nancy. So that didn't quite do it. Anybody else want? I know this is a tough question. So what's going on? Let's see. We go back, and I'm going to add that subtotal back in. If you look at the relationship between these 2 tables, double-click on it. This looks very different than what you would see if you were in the relationships window. If I am in the relationships window and I click on the relationship between 2 tables, I see a bunch of stuff that has to do with maintaining consistency, like RDI, cascade update, cascade delete. So please notice that we are not in the relationships window. We're in the query window. So what we're seeing is our properties related to the connection between these 2 tables for this specific query, and only this specific query. And I have different ways of telling Access what I want to see. And so far, I'm telling Access, only include the rows where the joined fields from both tables are equal. What the heck does that mean? Only include rows or records where the joined fields, where the foreign key values between these 2 tables, between these are equal. Only show me the records where there are matching foreign key values in the 2 related tables. So what Access is doing is it's checking out the foreign key field between these 2 tables first. And it does this before it applies. If I had any criteria to be applied, it does this step before that too. And it checks to see, do I have a client ID of 25, for example, in the client table? All right, good. Do I have a matching client ID of 25 in the payments table? Nope. All right, that gets dropped off. So the only clients we're going to see in this resulting dynaset are the ones who show up or have a matching foreign key field entry in both of these tables. I told Access that's what I want it to do. I told it, don't show me anybody if they only showed up in the clients table or they only showed up in the payments table. I only want to see people who are in both. This happened because that's what I told Access I wanted. I have other things I can ask Access for, but by default, if you never ever change the join type between the tables in your query, if you never change the join type, it will always be a 1 or what's called an inner join. Inner meaning bringing together what's common, what's the same about both tables based on that foreign key field. All right, well, what if that's not acceptable? What if my question to you was, list the client ID, first name, last name, total amount of payments, total number of payments made for every client, even if they haven't made payments yet? Ooh, that's a different question. This query is not going to work now, is it? Well, it can work if we change the join type. So these other 2 options, 2 and 3, we collectively refer to those as outer joins. So the first type is inner, and the other 2 options are outer. Be careful. 2 and 3 can sometimes be flip-flopped. If you have more than 2 tables in your query, 2 and 3 might not always correspond to exactly what I'm telling you. It sometimes might be that 3 is 2 and 2 is 3. So what I want you to be aware of is what the wording means so that when you look at the wording, you understand what it's saying to you. So this second option, an outer join, we sometimes affectionately refer to this as the outer join relative to the primary key side of the relationship. So the outer join relative to the primary key side of the relationship. It says include all rows or all records from the client table and only those records from the payments table where the joined fields are equal. It says include all records from client. Give me every foreign key field that's listed in the client table, in the table where client ID is the primary key. This would be the join that I would want to use if I want to see all of the client IDs from the client's table, where they essentially should be identified. When I click OK, notice that solid line between the two tables now becomes an arrow, and it's pointing away from the table that we have selected to be the one where we grab all of the foreign key values from. And that arrow pointing away means as Access tries to match up information from the many side of the relationship, so it says only include rows where the joined fields are equal, and then anything that might correspond with those related fields. If I've asked for fields from the payments table, and I have, if Access can't find any information at all about a particular client that was found in the client table, but not the payments table, it will leave the field blank, but not the record. So we run this query. And now we do have 16 entries. All 16 of our clients are here. They're all showing up. Phew, didn't think we could do it. But the other thing that's important to notice is that for the people who are in the client table, but not in the payments table, we do see blank spots. These are called null values. These are the people who were not in the payments table at all. Access found nothing that corresponded to these people in the payments table. So that's the second join. Remember, it could get mixed up depending on how many tables you have here, but we usually call it the outer join relative to the primary key table. Now, the other type of join, this is the least commonly used join. So when we say outer join, almost always, we're talking about the outer join relative to the primary key table. So whenever you hear me say outer join, I'm almost always referring to the outer join relative to the primary key side. So this lesser used join, include all records from the payments table and only those records from the client table where the joined fields are equal. This one's used for very, very specific purposes. I'm going to select it. It means grab all of the foreign key field entries from the many side of the relationship and match it up with whatever can be found that corresponds to the fields I've asked for from the primary key side of the relationship. And I run this query. And let me see if you can figure out what makes this particular kind of query helpful. What did this identify for us? You do know I can see you, right? When I ask a question, everybody looks down really quick like I can't see them. I can still see you. Over here.
This shows that, like, there's just money missing and we don't know who the payment belongs to.
Ooh, there's money, not missing, but there's money showing up, but we don't know who that payment was made by. What gives you the impression that we don't know who made that payment? Yeah, because everything that we asked Access for from the client table that corresponds to this payment, Access found absolutely nothing from the client's table that corresponds to this client. We don't know who this client is. This kind of an outer join, relative to the many side of the relationship, is most useful in helping us to find violations of referential data integrity. Right there, up top, is a violation of RDI. That's a client who's in the payments table, but not in the client's table. That's a problem. In fact, if we simply include the client ID from the payments table, so now we've got both client IDs being listed. And notice when you include the foreign key field from both tables, the field names are the same, and so Access has to give a little bit more information about which one's which client ID is from clients and which one's from payments. Oh, look at that. Yeah, we have a person, an entity, somebody made a payment, and we have no clue who they are. Just people sending us money. It's kind of nice. But the reality is somebody sent this to us, and it's a client, and now we need to figure out who on earth they are. Because somebody didn't realize the 0 key was sticking when they entered it. Well, sometimes when you decide to enforce RDI after a lot of data has been put into your database, there are lots of problems like the one we just saw, lots of violations of RDI. And getting those to stand out can be difficult. So we could alter this query so that we only see the violations of RDI. So what I'd like to do is tell Access, hey, can you show me just the records where this is empty? Or this, or this is empty. Any field basically from the client table has nothing there. What do you think the criteria would be? How about 0? That doesn't seem right, because we should have something showing up if Access reads what we're trying to say. What about empty? Yeah, it doesn't seem to be it either. How about blank? Yeah, I'm kind of coming up empty here, guys. What do you think? What would my criteria be to tell Access, show me everything that has nothing? What'd you say? 2 quotes. It was a good guess, though. Yeah, back here. No? Let's try no. Over here. A space in quotes. Whoops, I don't think it took my space there. What do you think? Come on. How do you think you do it? I was really careful about what name I gave to those blank spots when we first saw them. I said they're null. Blank means null in Access language. So if I want to see just those empty spots, I can put in null or is null. Access will put in the is for you. That is the criteria for anything that has nothing, anything that's empty or blank. The problem with the quotes is that the quotes implies that there is a character there, and with a null value, there's no character at all. And null values are going to pose additional threats to us later on because they're problematic in other ways. So I do want you to get used to the term null or null value, meaning Access found nothing, not 0, nothing, absolutely nothing that corresponded to whatever table it was we needed to look at. So this is a very, very handy way to identify violations of RDI. I mentioned to you earlier on when we started to talk about Access that finding the violations is very simple compared to fixing all of them. So nothing beats making sure, if you have the ability, after your tables and relationships have been established, to enforce RDI. Don't give anybody a chance to cause violations, because then you've got to fix them. So far, so good? Back here.
I have a question about the asterisks when you're using them for wildcards.
Mm-hmm.
So if you put just one asterisk after what you want, is that just the beginning of the word?
So let's use a wildcard symbol. So let's say, let's take one of these out just to simplify this. Anybody whose last name starts with a particular letter, right?
Yeah.
So I could say L, and then asterisks. Now, in doing this, I'm telling Access that any entry that is returned in this dynaset has to start with an L. We can have anything after it. Now, when I click out of that line, Access will also put in the word like and quotes around L asterisks. So when I run the query, oh, we don't have anybody with the last name starting with L. So let's change it to, we have somebody with S? Can't remember. There we go. Does that answer your question, or was there something more that you were wondering about?
And then you put asterisks on both sides, and it could be anywhere.
That's right, yeah. So I can put, if I'm looking for any last name that has an S anywhere in it, and you do want to keep in mind that an asterisk can represent an infinite number of symbols and also the absence of symbols. So this also could be a person whose last name starts with an S or ends with an S, or anywhere, an S anywhere in between. So this means an S anywhere in the last name. And so this is one of the reasons why we still see Smith showing up.
What if you put the asterisk just in the beginning? Would that indicate you're looking for just the ending?
Yeah, so if I put it just at the beginning and not at the end, that means the S has to be at the end. Make sense? Yes, over here.
Do you do that for an entire word?
Like how? Like, what do you mean by an entire word?
Like, say you're looking up a person's address or something, and so they live on whatever road. Could you put road in it and make that the lookup? Like, it could be whatever is the first
Yeah.
as long as they live on a road.
Yeah, as long as they live on a road, yes, and not an alley or, yes, so road. Now, the thing that would be important to know here is how road is represented within the entry. So if it's RD, ROAD, RD period, so we may end up wanting to look real quick. I'm just going to throw this in just for the heck of it and see what happens. Let's look real quick and see what entries we have. So we do have one RD period. Well, I kind of like the one that you came up with. But I'm still trying to figure out why that one isn't returned. Oh, I know why. Anybody know why we're not getting this person showing up? No? They haven't made a payment yet. Or maybe they've made a payment, but they're not. No, that wouldn't be right. They haven't made a payment is basically what's happening. So let's include all, and then let's rerun this. This should now. There we go. Yeah, so there was a lot going on in that query, not just that restriction. There was also what I told you happens beforehand based on the type of join. And so we were looking still just at the people who've made payments, and then so anybody who hadn't made a payment yet still isn't showing up in our list, but we were getting the violations of RDI. Other questions? Okay, the last thing I'm going to show you of the kind of basic stuff that I just want to make sure that you understand why you're moving through the mechanics that you're moving through has to do with calculated fields. And you saw some examples of this already, but I do want to show it to you and have you ask questions about things that are not making sense. There are times where you want to construct new fields that represent existing data being added together or multiplied by a constant or being subtracted from something else. You need to involve fields in your query in expressions or calculations. Now, I do want to remind you, when I first covered Access, I said to you that there is the ability now with this newest, well, not the newest, but with 2010, that version of Access, and with 2013, you can calculate fields in a table. So you can set up a field in a table as a calculated field. It was not something that was available before. And I still want you to know that you really want to use that sort of a field with caution. So typically when you think about calculating fields, it's something that should be reserved for queries. And there are a host of reasons why. And the textbook goes into a little bit of that. But part of it has to do with the amount of space that that field will take up in the database when it's used as a field in a table and not in a query. The other piece of this is it doesn't make that particular table so easily compatible or exported over into other kinds of database software because of that data type that you've selected. There was one other reason I had on the top of my head and then I just lost it. Space. I don't remember the other one. But anyhow, but what I do want you to know is that calculated fields still should be reserved for queries, even though you physically can use them in tables. Unless you know what you're doing, you don't want to do that. You want to keep these into the queries. So when you use fields in your calculated fields or expressions, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, the way in which you must refer to those fields is very specific. You need to use square brackets around the table name and the field name and the exclamation point, or what's called the bang symbol, in between the two. If your field is a uniquely named field in the query that you're creating, you actually don't have to put in the first part of this syntax. You can just put in the field name in square brackets, and that's it. So depending on what objects you have up in your design view window to create your query, if you have multiple tables that have the same field, for example, like the amount field, in this database, there's an amount field in the charges table, and there's also one in the payments table. So if you have both of those tables up in your QBE grid, if you use the field name amount in one of your expressions, it's not a uniquely named field because that field name is present in two of the objects that are being used to run the query. So you would have to put in the table name in brackets and the exclamation point. So one of the queries that we can run has to do with looking at giving the clients a break on their charges. So a 10% break, we want to write a query to list the client ID, the charge amount before the discount, what the dollar amount of that 10% discount would be, and then what the amount owed is, or the charge owed, after the discount is applied. So when you're looking at a query like this, you kind of want to look for fields that you haven't seen in your database anywhere. Those are going to be the fields that you have to make yourself. So this field that has to do with discount. So there's no field in this database called discount. That's usually a sign for you that you're making it. You're going to make that field. Is this not in your slides? What'd you say? There's a lot that happened? There's a lot that's not in there? Were there more slides that you guys don't have? It's in it. I have moved around just a little bit of stuff, but you guys can't find this one at all? 147. Now, why didn't anybody raise their hands and ask that? I had to look over and ask about that. You guys weren't that curious to know? Where'd this lady get this stuff from? No? So, to run this, the first things first, it doesn't matter if you need to calculate a field, if you need to subtotal. None of that matters when you get to the very first step of a query. What table do I need to use? Or tables, depending on the extent of the query. To get the client ID and the charge amount, I can get that from the charges table. And then to create this discount field and then the charge amount after the discount, that would again be something that's constructed with the use of the charges table or what I've used in this query itself. So let's go in and set this up. Make this a little bit bigger so that you can see it. Okay, so behind the scenes, what's going on? And I'm actually going to take these expressions out. That way you can see me create these. Now I don't know what you're comfortable with. You kind of work through a little bit of the mechanics in the lab, and the book talks a bit about using the expression builder. And the expression builder is probably the best way to get started with using calculated fields in Access. So if you look at the query setup grouping on the design ribbon, it sort of looks like maybe a magic wand with fairy dust or a cigarette with ashes. I'm not really sure what it is, but it says builder. That's the option you want to go with. When you pull up this window, you get a graphical user interface that makes it a whole lot easier for you to get used to the syntax of how to reference tables and fields. In the top portion is the preview window of what you're constructing. And down below, you can see different possible elements and objects that you can pull fields from your database. One of the things that we don't really talk much about with Access has to do with functions. Oh, look at this, built-in functions. Look at how many there are. These are all built-in functions that you can use in Access, and we're going to use probably like 2 of them. So we're not going to do too much with the Access functions, but you should know that they're there. We're going to take a look at the research paper's database itself. So you can see that object shows up with the A next to it because it's a database. And underneath that, I can pull fields from any of the tables that have been constructed and even the queries that I've already created because I can use those queries just like tables. So for us, we're going to pull from the charges table. I needed the amount field. And when I double click on it, and I do want to get rid of this stuff up front. I was messing around with the functions and something popped in there So this is sort of like starting with a clean slate. So I go in and I double-click amount. And notice when I do that, then the syntax, the brackets, the table name, exclamation point, field name, all of that pops in there for me. And to get the discount amount, I'm going to multiply that by 10%. Now when I do this, I get a default new field name. I'm going to run this just for a second, even though this isn't completely done yet. Notice that there's a new field, and it's called EXPR1. That's as creative as Access can get for us. I don't want Access to create an expression name for me, because if you have dozens or hundreds of queries, these are not very meaningful, and you end up having to go back to look at the expression to figure out what it was you were trying to do. So we can give this a new name. So we'll call it discount. And I'm going to pull this back up in the builder so you can see it. I didn't put in that new field name initially. If you do that when you first open up the builder, Access accidentally tries to give the expression two names. So I waited until after I created it, and then I went in and I put in the name. But now you can see it's new expression name, colon, and then the syntax that we just set up. And that goes right into where the new field would go. With an expression, Access does not put anything on the totals or on the table line. That's left blank. Now, in order for us to create the charge amount after the discount is applied, if we look at the syntax that was used in the book, so there's a little bit of variation in how we can do this. But if we go with the expression that takes the amount minus the discount, I do want you to notice if I pull up the expression builder, and right now this is called expression 2. Notice, oh shoot, I have to take that out of there. Those fields are showing up there. Well, actually, maybe that was something that I want to show you. So I'm going to take out this. I guess it's all interesting stuff. When I look at expression 2, notice that the fields that I created the last time I saved this are here. So the only reason why we see discount showing up is because I created that field earlier and then I saved the query. But it's also showing the new charge amount, which is a field that it's no longer in this particular object. So when you're creating a query, up until the point that you save that query, you're going to see nothing here to use in order to create your expressions. So up until the first time I saved this query, when I would look at expression 2, there was nothing in there for me to use. So the ability for me to say amount minus discount isn't possible. So if you want to be able to pull fields you're creating right here in this query, save it and go back in, is basically what this is all about. So I'm going to take amount, and I actually can now use discount because it is there. I put it back in. And I'm just going to leave this at EXPR1 and run the query. So this has 2 expressions in it, 2 calculated fields. And you may be annoyed at the fact that, well, discount doesn't show up as currency. If you go in and select the field in the design view, right-click on it and select properties, you can change the format to currency. And then the world is good again. Ta-da! Now the next expression is a bit more difficult. This one says create a query to summarize by client. When you see the word summarize, that means you're using the totals line. So summarize by client all of the charges made after 5/1 of 2008. So we also have a criteria. We're using the totals line. We have a criteria. Add a surcharge of 20% to these charges. List the first name, last name, original charge amount, and the new charge amount. So charges that are from a long time ago where people were assuming they haven't paid them, although that would be a more difficult query to write if we wanted to take that into consideration. So this is all a bunch of stuff that we need to do in this query. And the starting point is first figuring out what tables do you need to use. So here, in order to get first name, last name, that's going to be the client table to get information about the charges. That's going to be from the charges table. And those are the only 2 tables that we need. So let's begin constructing this. So first name, last name, amount. Now there's also a restriction based on charge date, remember? What other fields do we need here? We don't need... and in your QBE grid that you see, it should also have last name, because it does ask for last name. So I'm also constructing this. You also see it in the new one I'm making. All right, the charge date is after, what was that, 5/8? 5/1. 5/1, 2008. And if I've used a correct date format, I should see pound signs. There are a lot of date formats that are recognized by Access. So you should be very worried if you put a date restriction in and Access doesn't put pound signs in. That's a worry. That's something you should be concerned about. Now, I also need to use the totals line to do part of this query. I can pull it in now or I can pull it in later. But for us to be able to run this query the way it looks in the slides that the coordinator wants us to show you, I have to do this a very specific way. I want you to be aware that there are a couple of ways that you could correctly run this query. I'm going to show you this way first, and I'm going to tell you about the second way here in just a minute. So part of what's going on is we're summarizing. So we have to go in and look at the total charges. So we need to total up the charges. We need to use the totals line. We're grouping by client. So first name and last name are just fine having group by underneath both of them. We're not going to find any problems with the lowest detail level. When I run this query, let's see how well we're doing. Are we grouping by client? And how would we know if we're grouping by client? You would know if you didn't really group by client because you would see client names repeating. Are you seeing client names repeating? Yeah, absolutely we are. We're not grouping by client or first name and last name. We're grouping by charge date, and that's not what we wanted to group by. So of all the fields that have group by underneath them, it turns out that Access has determined that the charge date is lower in detail level than those other two fields. So what do? I can't take the field out. I change it to a where, right? I change it to a where. Now I run it. Oh, look, we're not repeating anymore. And the date restriction is still applied. Yeah?
We can't tell which one we don't want to, like which one we don't want to group by under before we run this. What do we do in the test?
So she said, what if you can't tell what you want to group by, that whole lowest detail level thing, before you run the query, what do you do for a test? And I had started to say, when I was talking about the detail level stuff, that it's not something that you can predict. It would be something where in lab, when you run the query, and you see that you're not grouping by what you wanted to group by, you would see that, oh boy, I need to look at what's going on here. So this would be something where you would be able to anticipate and fix in lab, but in terms of knowing ahead of time in lecture or on a quiz, you wouldn't always know. In fact, there are some situations where we get really complex into queries, and I might be throwing stuff up there, just goofing off, showing an example of something. I've been known in the past to add in an extra field or two and go, oh, geez, I should have thought of that. That's lowest detail level. So no, it's not something you can easily predict. And I would not give you a test question where it's a query that you have to summarize, and the right answer is, I can't do this because you've asked me to include a field that's lower in detail level than what you want me to group by. So this is something where when you see it in lab, you would then be able to react to it. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're only partially done, though, because we do need to calculate something. So in order for us to do this, we needed to take the amount and add 20% to it, right? Now, the field that we've got for amount is now a summed field. For us to accurately refer to it, we would really need, when we pull up the expression builder, we would need to see it expressed as sum of amount. Since we don't really want to get into a word match with Access, let's save the query, and let's go back in so we can see it. Because basically what's happened is, if I pull up the expression builder, With query 1, there's nothing in there until I save it. So let's go and do that. Save it as query 1, and we will go back in. And now when we pull up the expression builder, now we see sum of amount. Now we see that field. And we don't have to worry about getting the expression syntax just right because it's there. So add 20% to it. We could put sum of amount times 0.2 plus sum of amount. It means the same thing. Oh no, what happened? We were doing so well. Enter parameter value. Anybody know what happened? What happened? What didn't I do? Over here in the red, I saw you lean over like you were telling them. Do you know what happened? It looked like maybe you were saying, I think it's this. Or you may have been saying something totally different. But oh, but I let you down easy, though, didn't I? You can't just, it's traumatized you. He said, let's go back to Excel. I wish. Well, actually, we'll go back to Excel in a few more lectures. What didn't I do here? What didn't I do? I've got an expression, and it says group by underneath of it, doesn't it? And I said on the totals line, when you're using the totals line, and you have an expression, you need to change it. And it needs to be changed to expression. This is popping up because the syntax isn't correct. I need to change this to expression. And I could change the field name to something else too, but I'm not gonna. Now it runs. Well, that's what happened. These little things that happen, these are the kinds of things that you're going to be seeing in pre-lab, and they're going to drive you batty. I'm hoping you're taking notes. Some of these things I do on purpose so that you will see it, because you're more likely to remember it later if you see it become something that's an obstacle to us finishing this. And that's important. Questions on that? Yes? Why didn't I get a syntax error? Why did it give a parameter value error? I have no idea, because we can make parameter value messages pop up. Have you guys had that part of lab where you create your own parameter value query? I don't know if she's changed up the order of that. But parameter value messages really aren't technically error messages. They're actually ways for you to create queries that have changing criteria all the time. You could put brackets into the criteria line, and then anytime you run a query, the field that has the brackets under it, it pops up and it says, what's the new criteria you want to use for this query? So it's not really an error message, and I don't know why Access picks that particular message to reflect that. I would expect it would give me something that says, your syntax is crappy, but it doesn't. It sometimes just gives us weird messages. Either way, it means we've got to fix something. Other questions? All right, I want to show you something else, because what we're going to get into on Thursday, well, it's going to be pretty interesting. Well, at least by my standards it is. I don't know if any of you have the same standards I do with interesting. But what we're going to do is take a look at a different database for a second. Bank database. I have 4 tables. I have an accounts table, and it lists all of my bank account holders by name, by account number, by the account type. I also keep track of what these types mean. So here are each one of the account types that you saw in the accounts table, and this kind of outlines what those accounts are and what the minimum balance is and what the monthly maintenance fee might be for those fields. And the deposits table logs all of the deposits that have been made for a particular account. And the withdrawals table logs all of the withdrawals that have been made. This is my new database that we're going to work with. So what we want to do is to make sure that we have identified all of the relationships. So let's pull up the relationships window. Here is the accounts table, and it's kind of a centrally located table. Everything in this database is connected through the accounts table. That's kind of an interesting layout. We'll see lots of different kinds of layouts with databases, but type is connected to deposits through the accounts table. Withdrawals is connected to type through the accounts table. Withdrawals is connected to deposits through the accounts table. So these are all of the relationships that we have. So what I'd like to do, let's try to run a query. We found in the accounts table that we had a beginning balance. So perhaps this is the beginning balance at the start of March. And we also have logged all of the deposits, all of the withdrawals that have been made. And at the end of March, or whatever month it is we're looking at, we should be able to identify what's in that account at the end of the month. So even though these have different years in them, the idea is still kind of the same. You'd be able to pull out those deposits and withdrawals that correspond to a particular time frame and apply that to the beginning balance, right? What tables would we need in order to run this query? Probably we would need the deposits table, right? What about the withdrawals table? And what if we thought these might be the only two tables that we needed? Let's say we forgot about the idea of needing the beginning balance field. What would be your red flag here? There's no line. There's no relationship. This is a problem. If this is a database that you constructed, and you're still kind of a new person with access, you should be worried right now that maybe it's just that there is a mistake and you haven't established an existing relationship. If it's a database that we've created for you and you definitely don't see a relationship there, odds are there's not a relationship. And so now we need to think about whether or not this is even possible. Is that too much to ask Access? To be able to total up all the withdrawals and total up all the deposits? I mean, is there just a limit to what Access can do even if I spoon feed it? And at this point, what will we do? Why don't we pull in something that's related to both of these things? So a long-lost relative. So right-click, show table, and here's great Aunt Betty. Let's pull her through here. So there's the accounts table. This accounts table is the connection that bridges the gap from deposits and withdrawals. But there's another thing that's happening here that right now, starting right now, is going to be a problem for us. And this is what we're going to do a lot of on Thursday. You have 3 tables up in that design view window. Now, up till now, if you had to use 3 tables in your design view window, it was okay because we hadn't given you a problem situation that you needed to worry about. So we hadn't covered this yet. We didn't expect you to know about it, so we weren't going to throw any curveballs at you. But moving forward, now we expect you to be looking at this. Now that we have 3 tables up in this design view window, it matters. It matters what 3 tables we have. It matters to look at them carefully and to figure out, is Access going to get this right or is it going to get this wrong? And it's not flipping a coin that determines that. There's a real problem with the way in which Access pulls data from related tables in certain situations. I'm not going to spill the beans and tell you what that certain situation is yet, but I definitely want to show you what the reality is of this kind of stuff. What I want to do, real quick, I want you to jot down these numbers. In the deposits table, account number 110. When I run this query, I should see a total deposit for account number 110 of $10,275. Okay? So 110 should be $10,275. For 213, the total deposit should be $150. And 157 should be $100. Write those down. In the withdrawals table, 110 should have total withdrawals of $50,200. 112, no, 112 is not one that we're going to look at. Which one did I have here? Okay, so 157. 157 should be 1,000. And 213 should be 960. Okay? You're looking at the actual data in these tables. I have sorted by account number, so I don't have missing numbers further down that you can't see. You have to really trust me on this, and I'm even showing you, even if you don't trust me. All right, so now I'm going to put in account number, last name, first name, amount from deposits, amount from withdrawals. I'm going to group by in sum. All right, so let's see if these numbers are coming out correctly. The first column of amount is deposits. The second one is withdrawals. So John Krasinski, account number 110. Should the number be $30,825? Did anybody write it down? Is this number correct? No, it's way high. And John Krasinski could be really excited about that. Whoa, it shows I deposited like $20,000 more, except we look at his withdrawals, and it should be around $50,000, and it says $150,000. That's a huge difference. If we go to, who was the other one? 213. Brian Regan, sum of amount. What should it be? 150. What should the withdrawals be? What should it be? I think it's 960. And then who's the other one? Is it 157? What should 157 be? What should the total deposits be? 100? And the total withdrawals, should it be 1,000? These numbers are wrong. And this is a bank. This is serious. This is really serious stuff. I just put 3 tables up in this design view window. I made sure there were relationships. I made sure they were valid relationships. I did everything I was supposed to do. I made sure I had the right fields in the QBE grid. I used the totals line. And Access didn't even give me the courtesy of a, hey, you're going to screw this up message. And guess what? I screwed it up. No warning at all. No error message. This can happen time and time again. There's a way for us to predict this. There's a way for us to make sure this doesn't happen, and that's what we're going to do on Thursday. So hopefully you're excited to come back and see what's going on.